Hello and welcome back to On Talks, where as art lovers, we wanted to learn more about artists, their process, inspiration, and environment. Today we invited Kirsty Badenoch and Floriama Candea, two artists passionate about ecology, the broader natural world, and our place in it. We feel that between them they cover opposite sides of the spectrum in working with nature, while still rooted in a similar philosophical and theoretical background. Kirsty has worked with ecology both in terms of landscape architecture, urban planning, and research, but her focus right now has turned to art while also running a small gallery in London focused on landscape practices. We are very interested in her work because she highlights natural processes in time, space, motion, accumulation, degradation, and interaction, bringing forward the experience of nature rather than what our eyes can glimpse in an instant. We featured her work here in our first show at Non last year. As for Floriama, she is a very active artist, both in Bucharest and internationally, with a show currently running in Vienna. Her work is more on the speculative side and invites our imagination and critical eye to wonder what is our place in the world and where are the boundaries between rocks, plants, humans, and technology. Creating hybrids between all of these, she creates a more optimistic and unified world where we can look within and rediscover ties we share with the animate and inanimate universe. A lot of her work is fueled by collaborations with scientists and incorporates a lot of technology, giving it an extra level of rigor and demanding from us a second level of attention after the first impact of her pieces. Talking to them, you will discover both have a degree of activism, pushing society and communities to be more involved and aware of our surroundings and the way we want to live our lives. Please enjoy the following discussion.
Yeah, great. So, myself and Floriana met last week actually and had a really beautiful, very organic conversation around both of our practices, not really knowing what this talk would be about, but sort of exploring links between our work and how we work and kind of contemporary issues around art and ecology. And so, as Dimitri said, we're going to do a bit of a back and forth today between four, hopefully, if we get there, different topics which we feel are important to talk about right now, which might kind of raise some questions and that we can lead through in terms of our own practices, what we're reading, looking at, and how we're approaching these things. So, the first topic that kind of came out of our initial conversation together was a very dry one, questioning, was data. Um, and data, it's a strange topic, and why maybe is it creatively and environmentally important? I mentioned my background is landscape architecture and urban planning, and this is a world where data drives everything. It drives decisions on land use, economic distribution, ecological management. Everything is about facts, statistics, evidence. And I've found in practice this has been incredibly difficult when ecological systems don't abide by strict and definitive structures. So it sort of raised a few questions through my practice and that I maybe want to kind of pose today and discuss a bit. And they're kind of around how can data enable the support of working ecologically and creatively rather than getting in the way of these things. So this kind of set of questions starts to think about provocations around this. So the first being who or what counts and is counted. Obviously, data is very much to do with power and validity. Data is often seen as truth, and yet it leaves out a lot. Certain voices are heard, certain voices are not heard. Does data bring us closer or estrange us? We're used to, again, trust and truth and objectivity of data, but often when you're working with facts and figures, then there's a certain distancing that happens, particularly as a creative practitioner. And the facts and the feelings, there becomes a bit of estrangement between those, you sort of lose your heart. with ecology and ecological thinking particularly, how do you define the value of relationships? So relationships are complex, they're variable, they're not objectives, and yet they're some of the most important things that we have and that we feel and that of our environments are made up of. How can you evidence a gut instinct? Again, this kind of dichotomy or desire to pigeonhole or define, and the feelings are often seen as flimsy, as changeable. You can't trust them. They're weak. They don't conform to the scientific rigor or scientific kind of boxes. And can you pin down inconsistency? Again, we're working with climate change. How do we deal with things that are constantly changing in a world where predictions are also always changing? So some of the, this is a bit wordy, but we'll get into the image stuff soon. But I just wanted to start with a thinker who's been incredibly important to me throughout my work and continues to be, Anna Singh. And she's an anthropologist who's worked a lot across disciplines in Denmark. And she has some very dense writing and also a beautiful book, which I'll mention at the end of this. But she talks about old ways of researching and how this was very much built around knowing. So collating knowledge and defining truths and understanding everything. It's kind of accumulation of knowing. And she makes a call for, or notices a recent change and makes a call for more of an understanding where we look more towards liveliness and participation. So rather than are we trying to gain the ultimate knowledge, is there an interaction or a kind of participation or dynamicism or kind of exchange that's interesting enough for us to study? And she talks a bit about the apparatus in which we use as actually defining a lot of the stuff that we find out. And there's been a lot of understanding or a lot of discussion around representation of data and how that can be skewed or how that can be taken as a given thing. But if we actually look at the apparatus behind it, then we understand them as instruments of bias and power. And can we start thinking about non-human apparatuses of collecting information? To kind of put that into a bit more of a practice or think a bit about how the idea of data has run through my work, I wanted to talk about a project called Riparian Score, which was a project that looked to understand the landscape through drawing, but rather than imposing, it looked to kind of collect understandings and collate understandings through allowing it to speak for itself. So it's kind of an alternative way of collecting or reading or understanding an environment. So the project started off in the Hebrides in the north of Scotland. It's an incredibly wild, rugged place. It's just shaped by wind, weather, and very kind of volatile forces. And I was really interested in how can you engage with this place? What kind of information does it have that maybe we aren't able to see or access visibly ourselves in human time? And and so what I started doing was I was working with steel, and so I set these huge pieces of steel out into the water. And the first time I did it, it was really a test. I didn't know if anything was going to work or if anything would happen. But the idea was rather than me drawing or kind of collating, could I leave kind of blank canvas or a blank invitation out into this place and see what it wanted to communicate to me. So this was the scene, and I left, went back home, and then walked all the way back again 14 hours later between when the tide was low. So it started at high tide and then reduced down to low tide. And when I returned at low tide, then it looked like this. And it was kind of amazing for me. I think what was incredibly amazing was the risk, the openness, the journey, and then that this imprint spoke so much of this place. It spoke so much of the intangible, the ephemera, the forces that were inherently shaping everything in such a short amount of time. And the colours, everything about it seemed to be very much of the land, and it just seemed to contain so much more than what a quantifiable data, but it did contain a kind of data and evidence or a trace of this place. this was kind of amazing, and I carried on these experiments. And so I did the second one. This was on one of the oldest geological formations in the whole of Europe. This is on the island of Iona. And again, it was exactly the same thing happened. And I left this piece of steel at high tide. I went back at low tide. And what was amazing to me, even further here, you can see this horizontal line across the center of the piece. In just 12 hours, it had evidenced itself what was happening in deep time. So this, I think this island is, it's 2,800 million years old, and you can see the undercut and the algae and the kind of the shaping of the island geology through tidal action, and that was exposed in just 12 hours using this. So there was just something kind of uncovered for me. How can you read the action that a landscape is performing, or the interactions between them through material processes? And what can this reveal either about non-human knowledges or about kind of maybe old or new ways of relating to the interactivity in a landscape? Again, in this one, you can see very different mark making, different speeds for kind of ferocity and harshness. And so I carried on this kind of way of working. I went back home, which is a landscape that's a lot less romantic and pretty beautiful and slightly tragic. It's the River Lee in London. It contains a lot of rare and beautiful species. It also contains a lot of pollution, a lot of litter. So it's this really kind of industrialized river, and so I looked to understand it more. It's also, the process was very much less romantic as well. So it was dirty. I got kind of shouted at quite a lot for the amount of pollution that I was going to be exposing myself to through doing this. But I did carry on doing it, and over 3 months I collected almost 60 pieces or imprints of the river. And so these were taken at varying points down the riverbanks, and they are incredibly different from one another. You can see this is a bit of an archive that I built up, and it started to create this portrait of river behaviours and interactions of, for example, where algae bloom under particular tree roots as they touch the water, or how the speed on the inside of the river bend changes from the outside. There was a whole set of spreadsheets behind this. It's quite interesting thinking about what can fit in a spreadsheet and what can't. At the time, that was quite important for me because I just wanted to know. And I started understanding the patterns of how the river was let up and down upstream. And so it kind of became a bit of a citizen science project. I met a load of people who were working on the river and started collating kind of information just from going back and back and back to this place. And so this project kind of became a whole sort of ream of knowledge, expected and unexpected. And you can see some of the details here of, for example, where the algae imprints and where kind of some of the flood movement was let down. And so this was the kind of final installation of these pieces. I think there was something quite interesting in the pixelation, and also that within this pixelation was contained something intangible, something that was completely site-based, process-based, and yet holds all of these different layers of interpretation. I've taken these to an ecologist and also a riverine scientist to kind of have them analyze parts of it. And I think I'm still waiting for some of that collection back. But I also wonder whether it's an interesting part, but I also felt like for me, the whole process of using these creative practices and kind of listening to get to know a place and understand it in ways that are both quantifiable and unquantifiable was incredibly important. So that's what I wanted to talk about in this, and then I think I'm gonna hand over to Floriama.
Yeah, as Kirsty already said, we came up with these 4 topics that we considered that are common in our practice. We have like not similar approaches, but some ideas about these topics. So the first one was like data, and for me, data, it's an interesting subject. I don't work with big data usually, and I don't know if I'm doing like a conceptual work related to what you can now see on the screens. But what I always tried to do was to see what it means to be measured, perceived, or interpreted through data, because usually I work with physiological data and streaming this data into some kinetic or interactive installation. And that makes me think, when I'm thinking about the data, about these topics. Data as a living process, because we usually tend to believe it's like something fixed, rather than a process that changes our experience of the world or experience of ourselves. Data as a mirror of reality, because also we believe, or we are used to think, data is neutral, objective, scientific, a source of truth. But of course, I don't think data is neutral. It's always interpreted through human design systems, which usually makes it maybe not so objective. So of course, we cannot think about data and not think about the surveillance or the ownership of the data or the commodification of the body, especially when we work with like physiological data. So, and usually I try to explore these kind of topics in installations, like, and always having in mind maybe that data is not like, it doesn't contain or doesn't have like embedded in itself like the meaning, but it's also more like meaning is not in the numbers, but in the interpretation of the numbers. So what I usually do is this kind of stuff, the installations where I collect visitors' physiological data, mainly heart rate, oxygen levels, some the presence of the visitors in an installation, and transform them via usually technology or Arduino Raspberry Pi into some movement of some objects. Usually the objects I use are connected also with the natural world, so I'm using these, let's say, sculptures, these artificial leaves made of silicon that uh, act somehow as a translation of the data. So they interpret the human heart rate or the oxygen level. So yeah, I'm using leaves, I'm using like water tanks, I create like waves using this data, all sort of kinetic installation. So yeah, that's kind of my approach to working with data.
For me, it was very interesting when we talked initially, uh, how there was this, uh, let's say, discussion of when, um, let's say, can you trust data? Because somehow we are in a moment now where there's a lot of data gathered, and people don't, even though we know, let's say, that the climate is changing, a lot of people don't really believe it. So it has become very true that even though science has developed so much, we are also quite far, or like people have, let's say, removed themselves more and more from science somehow. And I think both of your projects kind of allow people to get more, get closer to science in some way, and understand data in a different way. And this, let's say, storytelling is quite important. And there's a lot of, let's, for example, Latour is talking about how, let's say, there's no, I think he's saying it, that it's not true that data and scientists can be completely objective also. So I think, um, you as artists can teach scientists, and working with scientists, you can teach each other how to communicate and tell better stories. So
As I said, data is not, the truth is not in the numbers, it's in the interpretation. So also when I'm seeing Kirsty project with the river data she collected, I'm not sure I can say that's data. I mean, what's data? I don't know. Is it like the plates are, you know, eroded, or there are just algae, and is it like the fact that maybe there was some grease on the plates? I mean, I think it's very hard to interpret data in general. I mean, it's not just statistics and you see the numbers or some graphics and you have a complete understanding of it.
There's a really weird thing about trust as well in that, because there's some sort of strange, unquestioning trust about a thing that is processed through a mechanical measure or through a computer system. There's, I don't know, almost as though there can be no room for error, even though there's something really. So in what I like, I work quite a lot, or also critique positively or try and find the gaps in citizen science, which is one of those fuzzy places where potentially you can create closeness, which I think is also maybe linked to what you're doing, Floriama, because you're allowing people to experience it and they feel a personal attachment, or they feel like they're part of the the thing, that your installation, or they're part of the experiment. And citizen science does a similar thing, but there's so much questioning about the validity of citizen science because it's done by a human being. And there's so much in Britain still, it's really difficult for the data that's collected by a citizen science program to be taken seriously on a political level, because it's got people involved, and people aren't apparently as trustworthy as computers, and yet the computer processes are never questioned, and they're invisible, and there are even more errors that can be made through statistical processes that are mechanized than through human observation or human measure that also allows other categories of information to be gathered. So a lot of, I think, what the data I see in my work was the stuff that doesn't fit in those categories or those predetermined questions. And so it might be that through a citizen science experiment, they're collecting water samples and they're comparing the colours every single day for 3 years. And what they see is one day a really rare heron has a baby, but there's no space for that in the chart, and yet what that's saying is something incredible about the cleanliness of the water and how the ecosystem's behaving. And so it's like it's some information or some knowledge that somehow sits outside of the boxes, and then it's either not credible or not relevant. And I don't know, I think there's just something really interesting in what questions we ask and what information sits slightly outside of those questions.
For me, usually is like in my installation, what I can observe when people are interacting with them is that they want to be true, I mean, even though it's an interpretation. I mean, I have some sensors. I don't know how good they are. They're not like medical sensors all the time. So they record some numbers, but people are getting super easily excited and want to see the data as being, the truth, the translation of their inside the biological processes into something more poetics. But also sometimes the externalized process of their internal stuff scares them or feels like more abstract than it should be. So yeah, it's always when you translate data into something experiential, it could be like a very um, confusing.
Do you find that people trust what's happening, or do they question it, or how far does the
It
questioning
depends.
go?
Sometimes they they don't question anything. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they fear that I'm going to use the data for something else than just an immersive installation.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, opinions are very different,
Mm-hmm.
which is
Mm.
good. I like that.
Yeah. Maybe in our, I think there's something really interesting about the power in data. Obviously, all of the stuff that you accumulate contains knowledge, and that can be used in a variety of ways. But there's also, I think it felt quite interesting, like who has the power, and in a way, are you by giving away your data, are you relinquishing your power, or are you, I don't know, it can be quite empowering as well to be part of something.
I suppose so. I suppose it could be empowering, but it could also make you wonder or think about the fact that maybe you are losing the control. You're not in control of anything. That maybe you're just becoming more controllable. And also data deals a lot with, right, like algorithms, predictable behavior, and so on. So, yeah, might feel empowering or might feel like submissive. You submit your data to something and you don't know what's happening next with it.
But I think it's
Mm-hmm.
also important to understand if you are predictable, or how you, let's say, your relationship with your predictability. Let's say, I think that's also something that even, let's say, religion and philosophy, they all kind of dealt with, like how, let's say, humans, are they predictable, are they not predictable? And I think, let's say, through your relationship with your data, let's say you can have a relationship with your predictability in some way.
Well, yeah, because when I first started this project, this series of somatic objects, I started it because I discovered this movement called quantified self. So a bunch of people tracking their own physiological processes, or I don't know, calories they eat, steps they make, uh, and all sort of data. And kind of they felt really empowered of knowing all this stuff about themselves. Their motto was actually knowing yourself through numbers. And I found it quite intriguing, actually, because I think all of this data can actually do sometimes a lot of harm. I mean, can make people feel frustrated or compare themselves with, or their numbers with other people's numbers. And I don't know if the company you're working for is gathering all this data, and maybe your colleagues can shame you that you didn't do like enough steps yesterday, and all sort of stuff that are, I don't know, maybe you're not, you don't feel so empowered, by knowing the fact that your heart rate is not great for your age, or like you don't exercise enough. So my position usually, I mean, when I work with physiological data, my idea is to try to make something poetic about it, and that's why usually I make like an analogy between humans and non-humans, plants and humans, all sort of uh, interconnected kind of situation, because I think in ecosystems and in natural world, everything tend to be interconnected actually. So I don't know why we feel this need to fit everything in the very distinct category all the time. So.
Mm-hmm.
One interesting thought I had, let's say, after thinking about, let's say, this data and what, let's say, and especially the interconnectedness of nature in general, is I've thought about, let's say, I think you had something in your paper, or we talked about it last time, about how, let's say, these mushrooms and the roots of trees, there can be like these organisms that kind of connect, let's say, a huge amount of forest, and then you can almost think of the forest of like a little bit like a nature's AI somehow, that kind of collects all the data from all the way from, let's say, the leaves all to the roots, and then through chemical processes it kind of tries to balance out and try to let's say make everybody kind of communicate and be all right together somehow.
Like natural intelligence.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and probably understanding this natural intelligence and how, let's say, do you think, let's say, because do you think, let's say, animals and nature has any kind of, let's say, data? Like, how does it deal with data?
I don't know. I believe that nature has, or natural stuff have like embedded rules, but I don't think they're like that predictable. I mean, that's like the beauty of working with living stuff, living material, because you try to predict some stuff from the beginning, or you try to establish the rules of the research or everything, but most often things are not happening. It's unpredictable, so you cannot know everything in advance, so you cannot actually, yeah. I, I think that's the beauty of natural world.
I was just thinking maybe a bit more in relation to what Dimitri just said about communication networks as well. And data is really weird because it tends to be quite disembodied, and I think that's where it becomes a bit dangerous, or where perhaps like Floriana's point about how it's then used, or yeah, what the interpretation of that is really important, because if it is somehow, I don't know, extracted, that's questionable, but say it is extracted and then it becomes disembodied from where it came from, and then it's used for something else. It's each of those cuts that feels quite dangerous, and where it can be misinterpreted or reinterpreted, or lose its meaning because it's no longer connected. And the thing about the mycelium in the forest is that it's communication. It's the stuff that weaves things together rather than the kind of the object in along the process. So the idea of communication or knowledge or connectiveness as being the kind of glue, and I feel like maybe the danger with data is that there isn't the glue there anymore, that it's been cut out.
And that somebody else interpret the data. That's also one of the dangers, because it's most of the time can be like bias. So a lot of bias is coming up from the way we read the data.
Mm-hmm. Do you collect data from what happens in your installations, Floriama?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I have some uh, data collected, and lots of Excels and sheets with data.
Mm-hmm.
People's data. I don't know. I mean,
Mm.
but maybe it doesn't seem. I don't have the name of everybody, every heartbeat that I recorded, or like usually they are nameless. Like I collect heartbeats.
Mm. Yeah, I'm not looking to get you in trouble. It's more like if we're kind of critiquing or intervening in a data collection process, do we then repeat that process ourselves in is part of our creative act to kind of, I don't know, then create data out of us? Like, when does the loop end a little bit, and are we are we becoming too scientific by then collecting the data from the things I don't know. It's probably not an answerable question, but just a thought in terms of what we learn from our own processes and how far we then take that and reapply it or extract it. Cool. So this probably leads on quite nicely from some of the idea of facts and empirical and objectiveness. So the second kind of topic that we wanted to talk about was boundaries. I'm going to start with a quote from a really beautiful book that's written about trespass and land ownership in Britain. And it says there are boundaries in nature. There are rivers, forests, escarpments, ravines, and mountain ranges. There are cellulose walls. But these boundaries are in fact areas of transaction, semi-permeable membranes. The notion that a perimeter should be impenetrable is a human contrivance alone. Okay, so again, a sort of few questions around boundaries. So Everything in in the landscape has to do with boundaries. Yeah, some of the questions. So where is the line and who has drawn it? Maybe that's a kind of similar question to what there is with data. The lines on maps might be abstract, but they control everything, as does the hand of the person that draws the line. Classification is obviously a colonial act. It segregates, it creates distinctions between species, it creates political borders. And so the idea that the landscape as a political entity is completely delineated by boundaries or by lines. Who are these lines keeping in and who are they keeping out? Am I in danger or am I a threat? They're perhaps a little bit linked, but the idea of these boundaries, it kind of reinforces the idea of a nature-culture dichotomy. It creates segregation. It's sort of areas for people, areas for nature over there. And so these are kind of issues that I've been exploring recently. And then in relation to the quote I just read as well, how thick, shifting, or porous can a line be and still be a line? Which is particularly interesting to me as someone who draws and who's someone, my practice has really grown from drawing. And so the project that I wanted to kind of talk through briefly in relation to boundaries was the project that was made in the room that you're sitting in at the moment, and it was Trespass, which was part of an exhibition and kind of a very mini residency at Non-Gallery last year. So 92% of British land is private and inaccessible to the public. In Scotland, there's right to roam, but again, 83.1% of Scotland's rural land is privately owned. In relation to this talk, I've also looked a bit into Romania. You probably know this much more than I do, but my understanding is that there's no codified right to roam, but this was a quote: people can generally walk, ski, or cycle in the countryside, provided they don't harm the environment or landowners, except in gardens or near homes. So there's a lot of different interpretations of where you can, where you can't go, where you're allowed, depending on what is your normal country. And this was something that I was interested in exploring in this project in Non-Gallery. So it was the first time I've been to Romania. It was interesting situation because generally all of my work is made outside, but we talked about making something site specific, and it was a bit of a challenge for me because I was working in a white room, and so how do you allow or work with the environment and the forces that create a space when you're inside a gallery? So I turned up, as I often do, with a blank piece, and I unrolled the paper. I had 2 days before the opening, and I set it out in this space. And then what started happening to me, this paper is a terrain. I always draw on these large pieces in the landscape, and so they become one-to-one. It's really amazing, the experience of being smaller than your work. But they also become these kind of strange maps, or they take on another scale. And so I started tracing and responding to the interactions that happened through the gallery space. So I was in the front room, and all of the other exhibitors were in the other spaces, and so they were constantly walking through the space, and I would draw the conversations that was happening. I would track their footprints, and so this kind of became a registration of the construction of everyone else's exhibition throughout these 2 days. It was quite interesting as an experiment, like what people were comfortable with, where people's boundaries were. So during this time, it was very hard to get people to walk on the paper. They respected me. They saw that it was my studio, that this was my work. They were artists, and so they would always go the other way, or they'd walk around this very tiny edge of the paper until I urged them over and over that they should come and use this space and walk on it and interact with it. And over time, they kind of started to believe me, and then they started to forget and not really care because it was the countdown to them opening their exhibition, and so everyone was kind of hurrying everywhere to get it done. And so so the drawing kind of grew over these 2 days, and then we had the opening, and this also was kind of interesting. I think that this project ended up being as much about the drawing, the act of drawing, the materiality, as it was the public behaviour and how people interacted with it, where their boundaries were and where mine were. And so we invited people in wearing these plastic. I'm really sorry. Disposable. I know, but we did it. We invited people in, and the point was to give some sort of invitation for them to care or for them to kind of walk on this or not. And we very purposefully made the rules weren't clear. There was an invitational kind of bin of these shoes outside. I think we ended up. I got some stats. We got the data. I think we ended up having 180 people who wore the shoe covers. 5 people didn't even notice anything. And one person would not wear the shoe covers and would not stand on the drawing and walked around the edges the whole time. And it was really interesting what happened basically as permissions were kind of hazy. People were very tentative at the beginning. Then a child realized they were allowed to stand on it and no one told them off. So they started dancing and it became this incredibly playful thing. Um, People were exploring it. Some were being much more careful than others. And then over time, people forgot. It became a carpet. It's sort of people started spilling their drinks on it or becoming more interested, obviously, in their own conversation than in this piece. And that also was kind of testing my own boundaries of how much I would allow this piece to become defaced or uncared about. And so I went in occasionally and started redrawing, and then the whole place emptied. Obviously, everyone suddenly realized, oh, this is a piece of art, and I was some kind of performer, and it became, it became a performance, which also wasn't particularly. It wasn't the aim, but it was just interesting to understand these different behaviours. And then here are some photographs of the piece just after the opening. And what became really interesting to me was it, even in this white space, it started responding to the environment and to the processes that were making it. And so you can see the parquet floor started coming through the paper. You can see wine started being spilled on it. And so it started to evidence the activities that had happened that night. The other kind of interesting thing for me as well, thinking about the kind of degradation or human interventions in a landscape, you ended up getting these tire tracks as the feet sort of shoes started to come through the plastic. So yes, I think that was what I wanted to talk about, and also consider in terms of social boundaries, maybe also in an art space where that kind of permission lies and how we work with that as creatives.
So, Kirsty, why did you make them wear the plastic shoes at the beginning? It was because you didn't want it to have like actual marks? Because for me, it always seemed like a kind of forensic piece. You know, you have to understand something by the footprints, by the marks that people are leaving on the sheet of paper. So why the plastic shoes at the beginning?
Yeah, we went back and forth quite a lot with this. It's a really good question. And I think it was a test of my own boundaries as well. I think to not have anything and for people to walk on it, there was no question. It felt like a provocation. It felt like a kind of extra layer of are we allowed or are we not? There was also kind of a stepping through the threshold, which became quite important. There was something also, yeah, slightly hygienic about it. There's the practicality of there's a lot of mud, and maybe that's fine, but it felt like yeah, I don't know. There was something about my own care, and some of me wished that I'd just let everything go go to shit. But there was
My
sorry.
first thought when I saw the piece in the gallery and the the plastic shoes were that maybe the drawing is made with charcoal and you know we have to erase it somehow with our feet. So keep it clean, but erase the, the drawing, the things on the paper. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think that was quite fun as well. I remember there were a couple of people that I noticed really trying to get rid of it. And I quite liked that as well, that kind of futility or wanting to be part of something or for there to be, yeah, it felt like there were some provocations there, but it's yeah.
Let's say if we didn't have these shoes, then the importance of the steps on the drawing would have been much higher, right? So I think right now there is kind of one result of one experiment of trying to keep this balance between the artist, the perception of the artists of what happened there, the what the people did and how they could contribute, and this balance between all of these forces.
So boundaries. That's one of my favorite topics because almost since I started, with the art school and my practice as an artist, I was really preoccupied with challenging conventional boundaries. So when I'm thinking about boundaries, I'm thinking about these topics. So one would be perceptual limitation because as also Kirsty pointed, human perception it's biased toward categorization. So we always feel the need to understand the world through this category of objects, to place objects in different categories based on our experiences or our knowledge and so on. So we tend to forget about hybrids. So the second topic would be like material hybridity, because there are so many objects that are existing in like these hybrid states. They are not artificial nor natural. They are not organic nor synthetic. They are like in betweens, or like they contain features from both of the one or more categories actually. So which prompt me to think maybe we should like redefine identity of all these objects, categories. How do we prescribe new identities to new objects, like object that we never seen before? So I usually thinking about redefining identity, I use this process called decellularization that takes all the cells from a tissue, be it like animal or vegetal, and leaves only this structural scaffold, this tissue that's it's still keeping the form of the object. You can recognize it, but it's very unclear if there is, the same object, like a plant without plant cells. It's still a plant, or it's like something else, which makes me think about like blurred distinctions, because usually with advances in technology and biology, there are these new entities created where it's the separation between nature and man-made are not so clear anymore. But that's also like kind of normal. I think it's what you can call temporal instability, because boundaries in general they shift over time. So something that was once artificial may become natural. And a good example could be, of course, bioengineered organisms, genetic modified plants, and so on. We are already normalized those. And of course, we always have like ethical dilemmas when it comes to these categories or these hybrids. I don't know. How do they have like rights or agency? How do we make the laws about new objects or new hybrids or new categories of objects coming into the reality or into the world? And again, thinking about the complexity of the natural world, the environmental complexity, I think that, yeah, as I said before, ecosystems always operate on these interdependent exchanges and collaborations. And yeah, it's it's very hard to deal with them, and also to always try to impose like new boundaries made by us, the humans. So yeah, these are usually my ideas when I work with this topic. I can show you like two of my works that deal with this kind of ideas. First is this work from 2019 called Uncanny Symmetry, a work in which I tried to just camouflage some objects by reducing some of their details, some of their features. So I was imagining how many details can I reduce from some photography of some pieces of rock and some pieces of meat in order to become like harder to place them in one category or another. So I came up with this series of pictures of stones and meat. They look quite similar when they are black and white. So yeah, it was enough just to make them black and white to become like similar. And in the and I've been trying to make it into a sculpture, and that led me to discover this process called decellularization. So this is a piece of quartz and a piece of meat without meat cells, of course. So it's mostly the collagen fibers that remained after I took out from the tissue all the cells. It looks like this in an installation. So yeah, my question was like, is it a meat if there is no more meat cells in it, or we can place it in a category just because we recognize the form? And that led me further to another project in which, using the same process of decellularization, I obtained this vegetal scaffold of plants, flowers, and then I implanted them, or I used them as a substrate for some cell cultures. So I grew inside this tissue some animal cells, and yeah, this is some electrofluorescent microscopy photos with the cells inside this 3D cellulose-based material that were like just decellularized leaves. They were growing for like a while, of course, while they were in the incubator, and then I stopped. We stopped the process because it was enough as a proof of concept that we can have these plants with like animal skin cells growing inside them. And the question was, of course, what would you call this? I mean, they still look like plants, but they have these skin cells inside them. So that, and at the end, I placed them in an installation with all sort of other objects that don't fit like a strict category. So I was having like plants implanted with like artificial muscles. So they were reacting to humidity, becoming some sort of natural sensors, and plants with like cells implanted with plants that were like moving because some motors interpreted some data and moved the tissue. So the whole idea was, of course, about all these boundaries and all the ideas we have when we recognize or not some objects we interact with.
It's very interesting to think about, let's say, if, let's say, humans have basically stopped the evolution of the world in some way, by inserting our own bias somehow into into the world, by making it the Anthropocene. We have kind of a bit stopped, like the pig should be what we consider it to be. This flower should be, we grow it in a certain way, so we don't let it evolve, and we don't let things, let's say, hybridize. Let's say we don't let the world become what it would become without us somehow.
Mm, I don't know when if we like make something entirely new, by changing some molecules and some stuff, and then let it free. Who has the responsibility for the consequences? Or It's not like we can control
Yeah.
everything we do.
No, for sure we can't, and we're proven time and time again that we can't really control. So there is a question of like, should we control?
I in some stuff we should for certain. I mean, I think some rules are good. If you can recycle it, you should do that. Or, but also we cannot place ourselves outside the nature. So we are still inside nature. So yeah, everything is transforming, and with everything transforming, yeah, it's
But aren't we trying?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like cities are trying to take us outside of nature somehow. Or maybe I'm wrong. Kirsty, you have more experience with this than me.
I had, yes, it wasn't just whether we are outside of nature, though, I'm afraid. I'll leave that I'll leave that to someone else. But I think that it's really interesting what you're saying, and also your really provocative projects, Floriama. They're so sensitive and curious and uneasy. And I feel like that unease, like sitting with that or being in that tension of not knowing, it's uncomfortable, and it's really exciting as well. And I think I feel really interested in yeah, in the idea, in the topic of categorization, like when does one species become another species? And that is, I don't know, it's almost like, again, it's become this sort of digital line, and who decides when one, I don't know, when one plant stops being one thing and becomes another. And in the plant world, that's particularly interesting because you get these strange, like, natural evolutions that have happened pretty recently. For example, in the which are those islands called, the islands off Spain, where they all have all the same weeds as what we have in Britain, but they're all almost unrecognizable, and yet they still have the same names. And it's like what you use to understand something, or what you use to define it, or even name it, and then when does it start to become something other? And it feels really exciting, your work, Floriama, exploring that edge. And I wonder, I had a couple of questions. One was how you name them, like what, whether you name them something totally different from what they were, or whether they are some sort of hybrid in that. And then my other question was about them being in the lab. Um, they're obviously outside of, they're in a hygienic environment. They've kind of been pulled outside of other forces.
Yeah, I had some nicknames, like, for where I when I discussing them with my friends or with my coworkers in the lab. So I used to call them like musclers leaves, or like the leaves, the mouse cell leaves, the human cell leaf, and so on. So not like very exciting names, more like um, shortcuts for the people to know which specimen I'm talking about. And about the lab, I think what was like more interesting for me when I was working with these, how should I call them? Hybrids, materials, subjects, I don't know. Was interesting actually, the idea of how you define life itself, because I have these natural organic materials, and I also have these living materials like cells, that usually our cells are not quite considered quite life. After you grow them inside a medium, with nutrients and everything in an incubator at the right temperature and oxygen levels and so on, at the end they consume those nutrients, and they are like dying quite quickly. You can preserve them, of course, or fix them in this afterlife state and observe them under a microscope. Otherwise, you have these objects that it's still looking like a dried leaf, but with like dead mouse cells or human cells inside it. So yeah, I think that was the questions I had, was like the limits or the borders or the boundaries of what we consider like being alive. Ideas like, I don't know, it's artificial life, uh, it's like alive, or can be considered life, can like let's say semi-living entities, like objects containing cells, but also like technology, they are considered like life? And if they are, uh, what kind of rights do they have? We have the same rights, or we make like just a new category and place it somewhere in the hierarchical chain of the living entities on the planet? I don't know.
I think it was even Asimov who, I think in the Foundation, one of the last books of the Foundation, there was a planet where they had a planet-wide consciousness that started from the rocks and ended with humans, and everybody had a voice, but even the rocks had a voice in there.
We have theories that minerals, they have their own voice. I don't know.
I think you've just led really beautifully onto our third section. Okay, sweet. Because our third section kind of discussion topic is exactly that, around participation. And I think the idea of ecology is obviously communication, as we've spoken about a bit earlier, but then also about multiple voices and the ability to hear or converse between different species. So participation, it's a bit of a buzzword at the moment. Everybody loves participation. In Britain, I think it's the only way to get any money for any project. And there's a real kind of acknowledgement that more voices need to be heard, and an acknowledgement of which voices are maybe being left out, and a real we're living in an exciting moment where we're becoming much more conscious of that and trying to sort of address the hierarchies that have ruled for quite some time. So I think in my work, participation is incredibly important, and it's in both a human and a non or more than human way. And so some of the questions that I ask are who's speaking and who's listening. I think listening is a huge theme in my work, and is an incredibly difficult thing to do in a world where there's a lot of voice, there's a lot of content, there's a lot of filling space. And in this kind of culture of domination still, then it's very difficult to listen, and to really deeply attend takes a lot of time and attention, is probably one of the most scarce resources that we have. In what language and what timescale do they speak? I absolutely think that rocks are speaking. They're talking, they're singing, and yeah, I think the more rock language we can speak, the better. The idea of translation, who is the translator and do we trust them? If we're talking about creative practice as being something that engages with more than human voices, then who are we to say, to translate what they're saying, or to say that we become spokespeople for another? And so I think there's a lot of ethical contention in something that is talked about in quite a romantic way as communicating or participating with nature. I think that there's a lot of critical thinking that needs to be done to really do that and understand the ethics behind it. How can participation be mutual and non-extractive? Everyone loves being part of stuff, but do they know what they're part of, and what is the kind of longevity? What are they getting out of it? And who is the author, and then who holds the rights to a participatory piece of work? And maybe that's a little bit more to do with a piece of art, perhaps a more tangible way. So I wanted to, yeah, this maybe links a little bit to Floriama's last project as well. This is an old school quote now. We're going back to the 30s, and John Dewey, in his book Art as Experience, he talks about the epidermis being only the most superficial way, an indication of where an organism ends and its environment begins. there are things inside the body that are foreign to it, and there are things outside of it that belong to it. And I thought that that was a really beautiful quote, in perhaps linking as well to what Dimitri was talking about, food chains. We are very much in the food chain. We are eating, we are being eaten. And I think the more that we can understand ourselves and our place within a much more complex set of systems, then the more we lose sight of that idea, or that false idea of hierarchy and human domination. So I want to talk a little about a project that it's a performance project that I did last year with a dancer and choreographer in Norfolk. And it was looking at embodying the environment. So we were looking at ideas of the body of the self, the individual human, the collective, so the community body, and then the environmental body. And so we conceived this set of relay performances where participants engaged with the tide and with the tidal action through systematic movement. So they were emulating and translating and projecting the micro movements of how the coast and the sea affected one another. There seems to be something a bit thematically about blue disposability, but I've kept these. These are all being reused again and again and again. But the idea behind this was that it's sort of visually reminiscent of forensic work or beach combing. So again, there's something kind of investigative about this. And it's this kind of ritual. And so what happened was, this was over the course of a day. It was incredibly windy, and we went through this kind of meditations where we emulated, as I say, the micro tidal actions in one movement. And so we were walking forwards and back and forwards and back. It was incredibly hypnotic, rhythmic, and each person emulated the next as we went from the coast, from the tidal line up the bank. And so with each translation, there was kind of a mistranslation. We started coming out of sync over time. And so these kind of micro fluctuations started becoming bigger and bigger as we passed on our movements from one person to the next. There was also something about action. And so one of the things that we were doing in our beach combing movements were that we were moving pebbles up the shore. And so in 2 hours, it took, 12 people moved 12 pebbles by 6 meters. And so there was a bit of a commentary about labor and energy, and also futility, cycles, but inevitability, and how important some of these shifts are kind of slowly moving all of the earth processes and moving kind of connections between one another. Yeah, so I think in terms of presenting this today, it feels a little bit weird because it was a participation project. You really had to be there and feel it, because it was a rhythm with all of the weather forces, and also a kind of conflict with our own bodies. Everyone was kind of aching by the end of it, and there was something very kind of, it was an experiential piece, and so it feels a bit weird to show photos and videos of it, because it's something that is really about embodiment. So I think that's maybe what I wanted to say about that. I think that the participation felt both human and more than human. It felt very respectful. And I guess the other thing I'd say is that what it did give access to was a different time zone. So something beyond a kind of human conception of time, but it felt infinite, as the ocean does. And so to really align your whole being, your breath, your kind of every sort of movement to that of the ocean, it was quite powerful. And so I think in that way, participating physically and trying to read or converse with non-human forces was kind of something we were exploring in that.
It's like I don't have much experience with participative work, because I usually make like interactive installation in which, of course, the presence and the participation of the public influence the way the artwork reacts or produces the actual artwork. But I think participation means like more like your type of projects, like one in which people come together and act more. Because in my work, usually, even though people participate, they donate their data to the art installation, it's not like an action, like something they do together with other people. It's mostly maybe related to the idea of authorship, or like being part of something, and less about participation. So I think your work is very interesting.
One interesting thing, I think maybe in nature there's no such thing as doing something alone. You're always part of a bigger system somehow. And I think what the work that Kirsty did is shows us, and it makes you feel, and it's also a question of what is futile for nature. Like there's so many things that happen in nature, and they might look futile on our time scale. But when you think on different time scales, you can access, let's say, things that are, that, for there is meaning beyond our lifetime somehow. And even though it's something that in our period looks very meaningless, after a very long time, it can transform landscape. And
Yeah, I definitely think that. It felt really like you were escaping linear time and moving much more into a cyclical, into a rhythm. And there also felt like a real preciousness, both to exist in a slower time and to, I don't know, to notice. So in plan, here's a plan. The tide was moving that way, and our bodies were moving that way. And so there was kind of this slow distance that was created, and we were also walking away from our own footsteps. And so there was something that felt, yeah, incredibly rhythmic. And then I would, yeah, and the preciousness of moving something, and also the scale of working somewhere like a beach as well. You become huge and tiny, like especially in the wind, all of the sound was constantly blowing into our eyes, and you become, I don't know, lost in some infinite desert. And yet the tiny, I don't know, when there's less landmarks, then you can become freed or almost fixated on things that are much smaller. So I think scale, both in terms of time and physical scale as well, felt really, yeah, it did feel like it moved, it shifted slightly.
As I said, because I can relate to the idea of participation through the interactivity of some of my work. These are some ideas I have about participations are related to consensual giving data to be part of a artificial system, or like a technological system that interpret them in a artwork. So, and of course, I always wonder what's the participant role in this, if it's like ambiguous, or if it feels like any responsibility about the way the work reacts or looks like with his, her data. Also, if biometric data is involved, I always wonder, does participation comes with like the loss of privacy? And because of that, because of these questions, I made this artwork called A Sculpture for 1,000 People. And I had in mind the idea of authorship, which I feel that nowadays is dissipating a bit. I mean, I always feel like there is more like a collective authorship out there. We all scroll on Instagram, we get influenced so easily about so many images and so many concepts and so many ideas, because everything it's moving super fast, and it's very easy to assume you had an idea, or not even to assume. It's like, I think it's kind of normal to realize that some things are just, collective ideas somehow. So I made this sculpture that uses or functions with people's biometric fingerprint. So it can gather like 1,000 fingerprints from the people, and it reacts only when it recognizes the one saved fingerprints from the database. So it's made to store 100 fingerprints of people and to function only with those 1,000 people that donated the fingerprints. So what I noticed when I made and exhibited this installation was that compared to, donate like your heart rate data, donate your fingerprint biometric data, it's a bit different. I mean, not everybody feels very, relaxed to give the fingerprints of the finger which opens their mobile or their bank account. So people usually stored like the small fingerprint, and then they forgot which finger they stored. So they had to do like many, because everybody's used to, usually when you open your phone, you use like the thumb, but because they didn't use that, it was very, they tend to forget which finger did I store. So they start to, and some of them stored more than just one, even though the rules was, just one people, one fingerprint. So yeah, it was an interesting work. It's not finished yet. I think I have like around 400 fingerprints. Maybe next time when I will exhibit it, I will get some more. But yeah, this is maybe the only work related more to participation that I had in mind for the presentation, because even though I make like usually interactive installation, I don't feel that's participative artwork. I think it's more like, interactive. I think that's the word.
Can I ask Floriama, that last image, was that when all the fingerprints are stored, what do they then become? Do you see them all together, or how do they accumulate?
So somebody store a fingerprint. Those fingerprints are becoming some cymatic experiment in the water tank, and the sound that produces, a certain wave or a certain pattern in a water tank, and only after you store that the fingerprint into the system, you can see this pattern that forms.
Okay.
So it's about your vibration in a large.
Well, yeah, technically it was like a H number, so I just converted those into sound, so it was not like super personal, like the vibration of my fingerprint. It's just a unique number. Like this, it's using cryptography, so it's like a unique number you assign for.
So you encrypt the.
Yeah.
Did you consider, let's say, a relationship between, let's say, how the fingerprints are different in how you encrypted this data?
I did, but on the other hand, it's, like I transformed that number into a sound, randomly chosen like a frequency, because each frequency makes like a different wave into the tank. So it's randomly, so it's not related directly. The fingerprint shape or lines are related to the actual pattern that forms into the water. But I don't think it's necessary to have this idea. I mean, it's just the uniqueness of, fingerprints. I don't know, uniqueness is a word, or I invented it just now. I feel a bit tired.
No, I think it's interesting to think about, let's say, this uniqueness somehow, because it is like when you look at it, they're all very similar. But I think the idea of a vibration is kind of like it's the same thing, but it's different somehow.
What I liked about fingerprints is this idea that even if it's like yours, you are never able to recognize it if you see it. So it's something that needs to be translated somehow. That it needs like a device or like a certain type of reading to say this is your fingerprint. Otherwise, if you see like 10 fingerprints, you'll never be able
We
to.
are, even though we use it so much, we are very removed from it.
Yeah.
There's something also very precious about that act and the idea of, yeah, the accumulation of all of these tiny identities. And I don't know, I I know the two projects that we presented are incredibly different from one another, but there's some really interesting space somehow in between them. I mean, I think that the project that I showed was experiential, but there was also, I don't know, there was something about identity, also loss of that somehow. And I don't know, like relinquishing yourself to become part of a beach. And I don't know if that feels a little bit like somehow to me what your project talks about a bit as well. It's
Yeah, my project also, I think it speaks a bit about temporality because, or time scales, because I imagined in my mind when I start making it that it's kind of nice to have this box that opens only when recognizes somebody's fingerprint, and eventually it's gonna be like, you know, a dead piece, because if those people are gonna die at some point, the works also, you know, disappears. Nobody can actually open it anymore, just those people that were stories in the
But
work.
I
So
guess you can, right? You have the
no,
accumulation.
I mean, yeah, with my fingerprint, but if I'm gonna die, you know.
But I'm
So
wondering if maybe one thing that could be very super interesting when you think about this work is this accumulation of frequencies, right? Because you have stored them in frequencies, and they like and I was thinking when Kirsty said this thing about accumulation, I was wondering if it basically accumulates into, let's say, almost like music somehow, like this sequence of frequencies. Um, and I'm wondering if you would consider, or have you considered, let's say, what, let's say, all of this kind of adds up to, or it's
no,
just
it's just random.
okay.
I mean, I would have loved to translate it in something like more meaningful, you know, in terms of frequency, but yeah, there was like no
but maybe
technical way
it's
of doing it.
maybe it's moving stones along a beach though. Maybe it's part of a set of actions that will, you know, transform in a different time scale or I don't know. I think there's yeah. It feels nice.
For me, I think it would be, as Kirsty said, yeah, it's fine just to make a conclusion. Why was this dialogue between us about um, our environmental approach? And yeah, I think that would be okay.
Nice. So I think for me there, oh, it's so you can't really conclude, can you? Because because it feels like there's, you know, each box you open opens up more questions, and that is the exciting thing. And I think that I've always found ecology and landscape so impossible and so seductive because of its complexity and the idea that Donna Haraway talks about complicating things, proactively encouraging things to be more complex. And I feel like if we're going to be thinking about more ecological ways of thinking, then that for me has to be key. I think we've kind of become, I don't know, I feel a bit weird saying we all the time. I think it's because there is a world of TED Talks and there's a world of diagrams that try to explain the world and justify it in as simple way as possible and in, I don't know, whatever, however many characters Twitter of the past used to be, or however long timescales we have to look at Instagram feeds. There's kind of a nature that we're struggling with and that we're encouraged as well to engage with, that's all about simplifying. And when you're thinking about ecology, the richness, the biodiversity, the life, the livingness comes in complication. And so I think that us coming out with more questions is a positive thing. The more participants that you have, the maybe you need less boundaries, or maybe weirdly you need more, because perhaps by making less boundaries you homogenize everything and it becomes simplified. Maybe by making somehow more boundaries you create an infinite amount of categories to the point where there are no categories anymore and everything becomes an individual. Maybe, I think there's a lot of contradictions in this field, and it feels really exciting for me to be engaging with them. I also feel like conversation is huge. I think ecological thinking and making and whatever media you're working with, it's it is dialogue. It's dialogue where we don't impose, and where we bring different voices in, where we work between disciplines, where we aren't just one author with one big idea, but we all exchange and share and give each other our work for the next person to then put their version of it into. Or I don't know, I feel quite excited by the idea as well that that co-creation can lead to ways of working together in new ways and relating to each other in more of an ecological way. So I made a little reading list. I don't know, yeah, how familiar the audiences are with some of these works, but just a few things that are quite core in what I'm thinking about at the moment. Some of them are from the 30s, and some of them are now, and some of them are stories, and some of them are more, yeah, theoretical. But that kind of might be interesting if people are provoked or inquisitive about some of these subjects. Then these would be a kind of they're on my table at the moment. And then the other, where are we? The other thing is, I know that you're all in Romania, but if you ever find yourselves in London, then I'm curating a little arts and ecology space in East London in Hackney, and we're going to have a really full programme from early summer all through the rest of the year. And we use this as a space of dialogue and sketching and experimenting. We've got amazing researchers, artists, different creators, a lot of sound people as well coming in and exploring stuff. And it feels really exciting to have a space where people can come in without a kind of huge grant 3-year project, but to just test something that's new or a little bit scrappy or inquisitive. So I think in terms of thinking more together and testing, experimenting, engaging in dialogue, then this for me has been a really exciting space. So there's some horrible Instagram things. Now I've slagged Instagram off, I'm now going to advertise on it. Sorry, yeah, so we've been running a series that's been about sight and sound. Sight is in place and sound is in them. And we've had some really amazing people who work with field work, field recording and conversations. And so we've built up a bit of an archive of them, and we're just going to kind of, contain them somehow, and then we're going to be releasing those. So we've had some really explorative sort of piece of research, and we're really keen. It's a non-profit space, and we just want to share what people are doing in their private spaces, and kind of add that to the ecology of things. So we'll share that with you guys.
So yeah, we called it on ecological approach. I don't know how I approach ecology. It's very complicated because I'm doing I feel I'm doing not so much. So what am I doing is raising a bit of awareness maybe about some fragile ecosystems, or about endangered species, or about some other problems of the environmental situation. But it always seems like not enough, or not because I'm ending up raising awareness in art galleries, to people that like they are quite aware. So maybe what I hope in the future would be like finding ways of uh, spreading messages or ideas in other contexts, maybe. Don't know.
I think what your work does really nicely is like putting humanity on a larger spectrum somehow.
Yeah, maybe. I'm trying to be like speculative because I think that's it works for me. Like imagining alternative futures, different futures. Maybe because I like reading sci-fi books. I don't know, but yeah, it's like one way of doing it, one way of engaging people into dialogue or uh, share interests.
So, what sci-fi book are you reading now?
I'm not reading any sci-fi book now, but yeah, the last one I liked, it was called "The Ministry of the Future" by Kim Stanley Robinson. Um, Very well documented about all sort of sustainable systems and I don't know. And yeah, now I'm reading like a history book. It's called "The Burning Earth." Uh, it's mostly about how we people destroyed the planet and so many ecosystem in the history. So
Well, hopefully we can
Nice.
recover. And what's your next show, Floriana?
um, I have this year with the NGO I am co-founder of. I have this project called Coding Drops. So I'm working with um, Diane Prikop here in the public, uh, and also with two very interesting artists, Mark Eiserman and Joanna Vreme-Moser. So will come up in the fall probably.
Right, looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Nice. I wish I could join you for a drink, but enjoy the rest of the evening. We'll catch up later. Lovely to chat. Bye.